Record here. Yeah, I should let you know. Let's see if I can. Okay, so welcome everyone. Very happy to have Avinoam. I don't know if you call yourself Rabbi Avinoam or something.
I'm just Avinoam.
Just Avinoam.
I'm an ordinary balabas.
Well, not ordinary, because I pick Kabbalah. And yeah, I've not read your book yet, so I don't know what you're gonna say. So it's a surprise for me also, but I'm very happy to host and to present to different audiences. We have my own friends, people that are interested in what you call Pnimius HaTorah, or generally understanding things more deeply and more broadly, also more deeply and more broadly. And I very much believe in opening these questions in English or in whichever language, but since you're in English, it's going to be in English. And hopefully we could create some new, listen to you and create some new context for new Torah and Torah that's more, encompasses more facets of the universe internally and externally, and in understanding the depths of the things that people have said in earlier sources and so on. So I think that that's enough for me to say. I'm very happy. I'm very pleased to present Avinoam. And I think, but just for basic order, I think he'll present for like about 40 minutes, and then we could open a little for questions or something like that. Okay.
Well, Rav Yitzchok, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be with you and with your people. I'm very honored. You want me to tell you a bit about myself? I wasn't really going to, but I'll go perhaps into a bit more detail than I was intending to. My journey started when I was 15. I was a Ben Zakunin. I was the youngest by far in my family, and very close with my father, Zichrono Livracha, and I was alone with him. I was aged 15, and I was with him one day, and I watched him have his fatal heart attack right there in front of my eyes. I didn't know what to do. And that set a little curious 15-year-old into desperately wanting to find answers, the answers that my father would have told me had he only lived to instruct me. And that set me off on a path of discovery. And I went into, my brother had already got involved with Chabad, and I started learning in a Chabad yeshiva locally. I was brought up in a family where I was destined to go to Kerem Biavna, if you're familiar with it. And I ended up going to Chabad because I wanted to find out more. I started learning in a Chabad yeshiva locally in London, where I grew up, London, UK, where I grew up. And then I went to Morristown, New Jersey, which I think is not that far from you, you tell me. And I learned in yeshiva, I learned in Chabad, was introduced to Tanya, Sefer Tanya, and it was amazing, and gewaldig work. And that stayed with me for the rest of my life. I had a very difficult experience when I was in Chabad, and the main reason for it was that I was going through effectively a breakdown following my father's patira, and coming to terms with it. And every Yerida is L'tzerech Aliyah, and Baruch Hashem, I moved from Chabad, from Morristown, New Jersey. I went a very unusual route. I went to Kerem Biavna. So educate a child according to his ways, so that when he grows older, he'll kind of stick to it. So I grew up in a house where I was destined to go to Kerem Biavna, and ended up going to Kerem Biavna with this blip of Chabad in the middle. And then I followed my course. I went to university. I studied actuarial science, and then I moved into the actuarial field for a couple of years, and then the accountancy field. I audited for 3 years, and then I got married along the way. And then many years later, I discovered a new way of learning Torah for me. In fact, this started happening about 12, 13 years ago. I was always questioning and always inquisitive, but I started a new way of learning Torah. And that is, and for the first time in my life, I started writing things down as I am learning them. So I had a chavrusa in Sefer Tanya, which had stayed with me ever since I left Chabad. And I started writing out detailed outlines of each parak of Tanya, and eventually got to the end of Sefer Tanya. I've got 150 pages of detailed outlines in Sefer Tanya. They need updating. If anyone's interested, I'll be more than happy to share a PDF with you. That's how my focused learning started. And I got to the end of these detailed outlines of Sefer Tanya and moved on to Nefesh HaChaim, which was a sefer I encountered when I was in Karen Avinoam, and then started outlining it. Got to the end of the outline and decided I had to continue with this way of learning Torah. It was amazing. I really felt like I was doing something. I had no anticipation of writing any books. And then I started translating Nefesh HaChaim, and that's a completely different ballgame to writing outlines, because when you're translating, you've got to understand, where does this word come from? Where does that word come from? That one comes from a Gemara in Sota. That word comes from Sefer Daniel. That's from Malachim Aleph. That's from wherever it is. And the Mechaber is putting these phrases together and concatenating these phrases from all over the place to bring out the idea that he's presenting. And when you understand where these words are coming from, they very often give a much deeper insight into the idea that the author is trying to present. So I was learning Torah in this way, and it was a completely different way of learning Torah to anything I'd done before. I got to the end of Nefesh HaChaim and then got into translating all of Reb Chaim Volozhin's works or writings that were related to Nefesh HaChaim, and then got into this whole thing about Tzimtzum and the machlokus, the apparent machlokus between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, and understood that actually when you look into the real machlokus, there wasn't a machlokus at all. Everyone thought that the other was having a machlokus, and they didn't have a machlokus at all. And all of that is recorded in 2 volumes called Nefesh HaTzimtzum. And then I had a break of about a year, and I came to my current sefer. My current sefer, Shomer Emunim, the Introduction to Kabbalah. So this sefer is, first of all, a translation and commentary on a book, Shomer Emunim, known as Shomer Emunim HaKadmon, written by Rabbi Yosef Ergas, who lived from 1685 to 1730. And in the last 5 years of his life, from 1725 to 1730, he wrote this book. And I'm not going to go into why he wrote the book now. I want to focus on another topic. As I was going through Shomer Emunim, I realized that I needed to explain certain ideas that the Shomer Emunim was touching on, but wasn't explaining them. And instead of writing footnotes along the way, I decided I'm going to write a central explanation of these ideas, of these musagim of Kabbalah. And little did I know, but this emerged, and this idea of emergence, hold that word emerged and emergence at the back of our minds now, and I'm going to come back to that later, but this emerged into a methodical, systematic presentation of the Arizal's Kabbalah, with a twist, in the context of contemporary science. Now, what gave me a license to do that? Why did I do that? And I want to tell you 2 reasons why. There may be others as well, but I want to tell you 2 reasons why. One's connected to yesterday's parasha. So the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, had a grandson. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Moshe. And he had inherited a manuscript from the Vilna Gaon, which was an explanation of basic geometry. It was a math book from the Vilna Gaon, written by the Vilna Gaon. He was Rabbi Yaakov ben Avraham ben Hagra. So Rabbi Yaakov Moshe. So Rabbi Yaakov Moshe basically organized the publication of it. Somebody got involved to publish it, and he wrote the second introduction to this math book written by the Vilna Gaon. And in there, he basically justifies why it's relevant for a man such as the Vilna Gaon to write such a thing. And he says more or less the following. He says, we've got the Sulam Mutzav Artzav. You've got Yaakov's dream of the Sulam, where the Sulam connecting all these heady heights with the ground. It's Mutzav Artzav, it's towards the ground. And he says, in order to go up the ladder, you've got to start with the first rung, and the first rung is here and now. This world. If we don't understand the world we live in, we cannot go up that ladder. We cannot understand anything up there. So this is obviously his explanation as to why the Gra, why the Gra would write a basic maths book. We need to understand math and science in order to understand Torah. And I wrote a piece on this with different zramim of the Gra's Talmidim, who all consistently say that in order to understand Pnimius HaTorah, we have to understand science. So I had written this in Nefesh HaTzimtzum. So I had to put my money where my mouth is. And therefore, I ended up writing a systematic presentation of the Arizal's Kabbalah in the context of contemporary science. Another reason, and perhaps this is more relevant to what I'm going to say in a few minutes, probably a few minutes. And if we actually look back to the language of Kabbalah over the ages, and the language of Hasidus, and very often even the language of Chazal in places, what I'm about to say, please don't jump down my throat, but this is the honest truth. The truth is that all the Rabbonim throughout all of history always used the contemporary understanding of the world in order to express their Torah. Always. The thing was, it doesn't seem that anything changed, because for about 2,000 years, the best part of 2,000 years, the basic understanding of the world was reasonably static and was more or less based on the Greek philosophy. That was effectively the scientific understanding of the world. And I'll give you 3 examples, and these 3 examples are relevant to what I'm going to say later on. So you have the idea of the 4 elements, the Daled Yesodas, Eish, Mayim, Ruach, Afa, the fire, water, wind, and earth. These Daled Yesodas, they come from Greek philosophy. Make no mistake about it. Yes, you can show me all these Mefarshim or Chumash that read it into the Pasuk B'Haaretz, Haisa Tova, and so on. Yes, it's true that they all read it in. Why do they read it in? Because it was obviously the elements of the world for centuries. Whenever they were alive, it was many, many centuries, and by now it's and it lasted for 2 millennia. So of course that was the understanding of the world. Of course it was going to be understood in the context of the Torah, because the Torah is talking about the creation of the world. It has to be talking about the 4 elements, because that's the mitzvahs of the world. By the way, we can upgrade them to modern times. Don't despair. You can talk about it very simply, that the 4 elements relate to 4 states, like solid, liquid, gas, and energy. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, we don't need to push it aside just because it was Greek philosophy. There is a truth to it anyway. The 2 other ideas I want to mention, another idea is the idea of substance and form, Shomer and Surah. This is also an idea that comes out of Greek philosophy. And another one, which is just so integrated everywhere. In fact, the Daled Yesodas are integrated all over the place. But this one, the Domem Tomer Chai Medaber, the 4 levels of life going from the inanimate to the plant life, to the plant soul, to the animal soul, and then to the intellectual soul. They come from a book called On the Soul by Aristotle. So that's where it comes from. But that's so integrated into Kabbalah. We've got schemas of Yud K Vav K that are linked to these to these Domem Sameach, Chai, Medaber, etc., and the Daled Yesodas as well. So it's all fundamentally interlinked. And it just because something may or may not be true anymore, because our current understanding of science is more advanced than that of Greek philosophy, it does not negate the Kabbalistic ideas that were used analogously to with the analogies of science to express those Kabbalistic ideas. But what we have to do today is to update the Kabbalistic ideas to the contemporary science that we have today. And the license we have to do that really is that is what always happened. And once we understand this, then what I'm doing in Shomer Emunim, the introduction to Kabbalah, we can understand is really not such a big deal. That's what we always did. So, and I'm here to talk about Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava. If I was to sum up, what is the book Shomer Emunim, the Introduction to Kabbalah, all about in one line? It is an explanation of Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava. That's what it is. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with famous Gemara in Chagiga, Yud Aleph Amud Beis. The beginning of Perek Ein Darshim, the Mishnah at the beginning there says the following. So it introduces us, Chazal introduce us. One of the sources for the fact that there is a Kabbalah in Chazal is this Mishnah. There is something going on here and nobody is really mafarish what this is. So we've got, it goes like this. Ein Darshim ba'arayas bishlosha. V'lo b'maaseh bereishis bishnayim. So we are told we're not allowed to expound on certain things, including this thing, something called Maaseh Bereishit, and another thing called Maaseh Merkava. And we're very restricted on who we can give it over to, just a couple of individuals or maybe no one, unless they are suitable for this information. So I hear you ask, I hear you shout at me, okay, I'm about to tell you all about Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava. I've just written a book on it. How dare I go against the Gemara and the Mishnah and to come along and do this? So Rav Avram Yitzchok Cohen Cook explains, he asked the basic question, there is such a thing as Yeshivas HaMekubalim. How can it be that you've got perhaps hundreds of students sitting in a yeshiva learning Kabbalah, where you've got this idea of Ein Darshim? And he explains based on the Shari Ora, which is an early Kabbalistic work, a nuance in the Shari Ora. He explains that when what the Mishnah is talking about practical Kabbalah. Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava is that the Gemara is talking about is about practical Kabbalah, about taking Kabbalah and doing things with it, doing a Maaseh, changing something in this world as a result of it. And I can tell you, without any anivus whatsoever, no humility here at all, I don't know anything about practical Kabbalah. So if you were coming to this call because you wanted to have an insight into some hocus pocus we can do, this is not the talk for you. But what is the Maaseh? What is Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Kabbalah and Maaseh Merkava? So the place to start, we cannot omit commenting on the Rambam. The Rambam starts at the very beginning of his Mishnah Torah of Hilchas Deos, Prakim Aleph to Daled. He presents what are Maaseh Merkava in the first two Prakim. And towards the end of Perek Sheni, he actually says the first two Parakim relate to Maaseh Merkava, and then he's got Parakim Gimel and Dalet, and towards the end of Perek Dalet, he mentions that the Parakim Gimel and Dalet are all about Maaseh Bereishit. So Rav Yosef Ergas in Shomer Emunim, towards the beginning of Shomer Emunim, he deals with the question of authenticity of Kabbalah, and one of the questions he deals with is, how comes the Rambam, the Nesher HaGodol, doesn't say anything about Kabbalah? And his basic answer, without going into this too deeply, his basic answer is that not everybody, not all the great Gedolei Hadar were privy to the Masorah of Kabbalah. Now, I deal with this in much greater context and detail in my Sefer. The Shomer Emunim, in the Introduction to Kabbalah, explains the background to this and explains the whole idea of the authenticity of Kabbalah and how it comes down a particular Hishtalshelis Hadoros through unique individuals in each generation, some of whom we know, some of whom we don't know, and why the presentation of Kabbalah was different to why they're handing down the Masorah of Kabbalah was different to the Masorah of the rest of Torah. That's not a topic I want to get into now. But the bottom line is that Rav Ergas is docha b'shtei adayim. He's docha, he pushes aside the position of the Rambam and basically says the Rambam did not have a Masorah of Kabbalah, and therefore nothing that he says is relevant and has any bearing on any discussion in Kabbalah. It's quite an amazing statement. I didn't say it. Rav Ergus said it. By the way, Rav Kamenetsky and his Emes Liakov towards the beginning of his comments on Parshas Bereishit, he is also docher what the Rambam says about Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava. And he says it was Das Atzmo, which is a similar thing to what Ergus says, but he says it from a different perspective. But the bottom line is the Rambam's position on Maaseh Bereishit and Merkava is not part of this discussion. So, so what therefore is Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava? What are they? So, according to the Arizal, so in order to explain that, I need to explain a whole sequence of things, and please bear with me, and we will please God in the not too distant future get to explain what is Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava. So first of all, I want to talk about things that we call Kabbalistic worlds in order to understand these ideas. We need to talk about worlds very, very quickly. What is a Kabbalistic world? And there are perhaps 5 general categories of world that we will talk about that you will have heard, may have heard of when talking about Kabbalah. You have something called Adam Kadmon, then you have Adam de Atzilus, Adam de Bria, Adam de Yetzira, Adam de Asiya. All of these worlds, I've added in Adam de before all of them because that's the full name of each of these worlds. They are all a template of each other called Adam, and that template is known in Kabbalistic language as the Shir Koma. There is a reminiscence of every single level of these worlds within each other. They're all manifest within each other. Now, what does that mean? They're manifest within each other. What's the difference between one world and another world? Is one world over here and another one over there? No, we're not talking about physical things. We're not talking about things, one thing is here and one thing is there. We're talking about a perceptual difference, a way of relating to the world, a perceptual difference. And I have to here give you a scientific analogy, a very simple one. And here we're going to talk about worlds using this thing called a piece of paper. And so I ask you, what is this? And I just said it's a piece of paper, but what else is it? It's paper molecules. What else is it? The paper molecules are made out of protons and neutrons, atoms rather, and then protons and neutrons. And the protons and neutrons are made out of quarks, and the quarks might be made out of these things called theoretical things called strings. But what is this? Is it paper? Is it paper molecules, atoms, protons, neutrons, quarks, or strings? And the answer is, it's all of them together, but it all depends on how we look at it. And this is, I think, a very good analogy, and maybe more than analogy, to the concept of worlds. These are all physical levels, call them levels. I'm showing you levels up top to bottom here, where you've got the paper. The paper is the top level, and going down the levels, going to the paper molecules, going down to the atoms, going down to the protons and neutrons, down to the quarks, and down to the strings. We go down these levels. Each level is a different perspective of looking at the paper. Which one is the truth? They're all true. They're all true simultaneously. If I had goggles on that could look at the shadows of atoms, if I had an electron microscope and I was looking at the shadows of atoms, I would see atoms. And if I had quark goggles on, I would see quarks. So these are all different, so to speak, olamos, all different worlds within the piece of paper. Now notice, and this is a very important point, notice the sequence that I said. I said the top level in this example is the paper, and the bottom level in this example are the quarks or strings. Now that's a crucial understanding for Kabbalah, because there are many people out there who've written books about science and Kabbalah, and they flip it over. They flip it over the other way, and they say the highest level is the quarks, and they come along with all sorts of imaginations about quantum theory and connecting quantum theory to Radla and to high levels of Kabbalah. And it actually is, and I'm going to explain this soon in the context of the Leshem, that it's actually the other way around. And the highest level of uncertainty is at the bottom, is at the quarks and the strings. Okay, so this is the idea of the worlds that Rav Eregus explains is a perceptual difference. So all of these Adam de Asiya, Adam de Bria, the Yitzira, Adam de Bria, Adam de Atzilus, Adam Kadmon, all of these worlds are different levels of perception. And at the moment, we exist within the lowest world within Adam de Asiya. We're in the lowest of all of these levels, of all of these worlds. And our perception is about as minimal as it can be. And our objective is to expand our perception and be able to see the bigger and bigger and bigger picture. And we'll get back to that, I hope, soon. So that's the basic idea of worlds. So I mentioned the Leshem. The Leshem comes along and he's mafarish a Mishnah in the Sefer Yetzirah. It's quite a well-known Mishnah, and the Lashon's well-known. Perhaps it kind of connects to L'chadodi that we say on Friday night. So he explains this. It says in Sefer Yetzirah, it says, Na'utz sofan b'techilasan, utechilasan b'sofan. Now the end of one world is wedged into the beginning of another, and the beginning of another world is wedged into the end of that world. What he actually does, I'm going to repeat it, don't worry. And what he actually does is he splits these two statements into two separate statements. They are talking about two different things. Now, each world of perception has its own 10 Sephiroths. And I'll talk about what Sephiroths are in a minute. But all we really need to know is that the top level Sephira is something called Keter, Keser, and the lowest one is Malchus. So, Na'utz Sofan B'techilasan, the last level of a higher world, we're talking about a creation process on a top-down basis. We're going from the top level, let's say from Adam Kadmon to Atzilus to Bria to Yitzira to Asiya. We're going down in a top-down level. So at any juncture between these two, let's say from Yitzira to Asiya to our place, to our neck of the woods, if we're going from Yitzira to Asiya, now Sofan, the end of Yitzira, which is the Malchus of Yitzira, now Sofan B'tchinasam it flips over to become the Keter, the first level of the lower world. And then the second statement, once we have that first level of the lower world, that now T'chilasan, that first level then flips over and becomes the lowest level of the lowest world. So you have a gap in the creation process of this lower world of Asiya from the higher world of the Yitzira. You have the Keter of the Asiya, which is generated from the Malchus of Yitzira. That Keter of Asiya flips over and skips out all of these Sephirot and all the 9 Sephirot in between and becomes the Malchut of the bottom. There's a gap. There's a gap. And what does that gap cause? That gap effectively is the Tzimtzum. That gap, Tzimtzum, is where the lower level cannot relate to the higher level because externally there is a disconnect between the higher level and the lower level. That gap is also created by the higher level is known as Tohu, and then by flipping over it shatters, maybe Shviras HaKelim, it shatters and becomes the Rishimu, it becomes also another expression is the Gulim, it becomes the basic elements of the lower world. So let's say that again. The Keter flips over and becomes the Rishimu, the basic elements of the lower world. And then what happens is there's this thing that comes in from the higher world called Yosher. It comes in and starts working on this thing called the Rishimu, the elements, and it changes their configuration. Now, I've just said a whole load of things. It may not mean very much to you. And let's now explain 2 more points and then put some real meaning behind that. Okay, so the 2 more points are, what are the difference between 2 words in Kabbalah called Sephiroth and Partsuf? Sephiroth, in a word, really in a nutshell, it's a fantastic mnemonic. It's a very good way of remembering what does Sephiroth mean. The word in English actually has the same syllables, the same consonants as the word Sephiroth in separate in English is the same consonants as the word Sephiroth in Hebrew. Sephiroth. The concept of Sephiroth are separation. This top-down creation of one world from another, creating the Rishimu at the bottom of each new world level, is creating separation in the lower level, whereas there was more relative unity in the higher levels. It's creating more and more separation as it's cascading down, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is cascading down the creation process from the higher worlds to the lower worlds. Okay, so you have the Sephiroths are created and they generate, the process of the Sephiroths generates separation. On the other hand, there is the opposite of that. There is something called Partsuf. And Partsuf is the major aspect of the Arizal's Kabbalah. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about the Arizal's Kabbalah, they don't talk about Partsuf because there isn't really any way of understanding what they are until 1972, when a certain scientist wrote a paper called More is Different. But we'll get to that hopefully soon. So the concept of Partsuf, what is a Partsuf? We can only understand it really in the context of contemporary science. But I'm just going to give a basic definition of the Partsuf, and we're going to come back to the contemporary science soon. I hope I'm not going to overdo my time here, but we'll see. So what is a Partsuf? Partsuf means face. That's what it means. And by the way, I should tell you here, if there's any idea in Kabbalah that we cannot understand in the context of our world, we don't understand it at all. It's meaningless. We can't talk about these spiritual things, these mystical things, because if at the end of the day, when we're talking about Kabbalah, we really are only talking about it in the context of things that we can understand. If they're not humanly understandable, why are we talking about them? And the truth is they are humanly understandable. And it's only now with the recent advances in science that we can truly begin to start understanding some of these ideas. And so the idea of Partsuf is actually a very simple idea. But with science, we can understand what it really means. So Partsuf is a face. I have a face. When you're looking at my face, you see my eyes, my nose, my mouth, my ears.
Give me a second. I'm sorry. I muted everyone, but I need to unmute you. Gosh. Here, give me a second. You have to unmute yourself. Because I muted everyone, but you're not the host, so you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay, you're going to have to just tell me when.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. It's good.
What was I talking about when you muted?
It's okay.
Me?
It's okay. No, you continue from the parts of. You're good. Continue where you are.
Okay, thank you. So Partsuf. What is a Partsuf? Partsuf is a face. When you look at my face, you see my eyes, my ears, my nose, my mouth, my cheeks, all these different things. If you were to lay out all of the parts of my face on a table, you'd have body parts. You wouldn't have a face. It's only when you put the parts of the face into a particular configuration and integrate them together, then you have an emergence of a face, and you see the window of my soul, or whatever you see in me. You see something more than the Sephiroth, the separate elements of my face. So my eyes, ears, mouth, nose are the separate elements of my face. They are the Sephiroth, whereas my face itself is the larger whole, which is much more than the sum of the parts, and therefore it's called the parts, and that's what's called a Partsuf. And that plays through absolutely everything in existence. So let's come back to the Leshem now. let's come back to the Leshem and talk about the Leshem. So the Leshem says that the creation of the lower world comes from Keter, the Tohu, breaks down into the Shivrei, the broken shards of Tohu, which becomes the Rishimu. And then you have the Yosha, which comes in, this additional infusion, which comes in, creative infusion called Yosha. What does that do to the lower parts? What it does is it rearranges and configures them and integrates them together to create a partsuf out of the underlying elements of the Rishimu. And that partsuf is on many, many different levels, is the lower world that is created, including all the sub-partsufim, you and me, that we exist as partsufim within the larger partsuf of the world. Now, if you're not with me yet, you will be with me soon. I need to now jump to the Eitz Chaim. The Eitz Chaim, recorded by Rav Chaim Vital of the Arizal's Kabbalah, closes, it's crescendo, it finishes with the last parak of Shar Nun, parak Yud. It finishes with an explanation as follows. By the way, this explanation is also the closing statement of another work of the Arizal's Torah called Mavosha Arim. So by virtue of the fact that it is the closing statement, you could say that this is the crescendo, in a sense, of understanding of perhaps the Arizal's Kabbalah. And he talks about the creation process of all the worlds, but he uses this world as the example. And he uses the three ideas that I mentioned right at the beginning. He says that there are three ideas of the four elements of the concepts of substance and form, Shomer and Surah, and then of domain, Tzemach, Chai, and Medaber. He uses these three ideas, these three contemporary scientific ideas of his day, in order to express what happens within our physical world. And he says that what happens to our physical world is the same, is a reflection, it's not the same, it's a reflection of everything that happens upstairs and upstairs and upstairs and so on. So what happens in this world? So when the Keter, so this, using the Leshem still here, when the Keter turns into the Rishimu, the element, it creates, now coming to the Eitz Chaim, and he talks about the creation of the underlying elements of this world. When you integrate the elements of this world, you go up the levels of domain, Tzomeach, Chai, Medaber. So what does he say? You integrate the underlying elements of the world and you come up with a nefesh hamur keves, he calls it, like an integrated nefesh. So that might be that if you have the underlying elements of the world, that might be creating certain compounds, perhaps, chemical compounds, if you wish. And then you go from the nefesh hamur keves, you go to the next level of the domain. You've got all the domain, you've got the mountains and the seas and whatever. And then you add, so at all stages, the lower level is the Shomer. You've got this underlying Shomer that was, we know from the Leshem, that was the Keser that turned into the Malchut, the Rishimu of the lower world. So the Rishimu of the lower world becomes the underlying substance. It's the Shomer in the language of the Arizal. That is the basic Shomer. When we apply a bit of Yosher, we apply a bit of Tzura, it's called, a form. We take the substance, we apply a bit of form, we apply a bit of Yosher, in a bit of configuration to the underlying elements, then they become the compounds of this world. Then that level of the compounds becomes the next level of substance to which we add more Yosher, more Tzura, more form. We're not changing anything, it's still the same thing. And then that becomes the domain. It becomes the mountains and the planets and whatever. It becomes the rocks, etc. And the water and the seas. It becomes the inanimate objects of the world. Then we apply a bit more Yosha, a bit more Tzura, a bit more configuration. And lo and behold, you have the Nefesh Hatzomachas. You have plant life, the plant soul. Plants emerge. You've got this concept of emergence. And symbiosis, you've got an integration of different things, the elements of the world, and then you put them together, and all of a sudden you have this life form, plant life comes out of it. And then you add more tzura, more yosher into the mix, pour a bit more on. We got now a relative chomer of the domain and the tzameach. We add a little bit more, and we end up with chai. And we pour a little bit more on, more tzura, more yosher, and we end up with medaba, we end up with humans. What are humans? We are a symbiosis of all of these underlying things. We've got the inanimate, we've got these inanimate elements within our bones, within our body is full of the inanimate, but it's also full of plant life. In fact, so much so that, did you know that we've got the microbiota in our gut that without them, in fact, more than 50% of the cells in human beings are not even human. They don't have human DNA. And we've got these bacteria in our gut, and they form part of an overall ecosystem, a human ecosystem, without which we cannot digest our food, which means without which it's almost like an organ in its own right, without a vital organ in its own right, without which we cannot live. We need the microbiota, we need the plant life, the tzamacha, the nefesh tzamachas in our gut in order to be able to live. So we are a compound being, an ecosystem, which is made up of all the things below us, of the domain, the tzameach, the chai, and we have an emerging mochin, an emerging intellect that comes out of that. At each level between these levels of the domain to the tzameach, there's an emerging intellect that emerges when you go up that level. And then you go from that level to the next level, from the tzameach, from the plant life to the chai. There's an emerging intellect that differentiates the chai from the tzameach and the domain. And then we get to the human life, and then there's an emerging intellect with human life. In 1972, a professor called Professor Philip Anderson wrote a paper. Professor Philip Anderson was a Nobel laureate in science and physics, and I think it was condensed matter physics. I can't remember the field exactly, but he was not into particle physics. And he wrote it was really it was a sensational paper that challenged the way scientists think. You see, most scientists are called reductionists. They say, this piece of paper, what is it really? They say, really, it's made out of quarks and strings. And if we have a grand theory of everything, that we can understand how quarks work or strings work, then we know everything about the piece of paper. We know all the properties about the piece of paper. Comes along Professor Anderson, he said the following. He said, no. If I know everything about particle physics, I don't know anything necessarily about condensed matter physics. I cannot project and understand what is chemistry. I cannot know the rules of biology. I cannot understand economics. I cannot understand psychology. There is no grand theory of everything. At each of these levels, in our language or in the language of Kabbalah, at each higher level of paratsuf, at each larger ecosystem of looking at things, there's an emerging intellect that comes out that wasn't there in the lower level. And even if we do find a grand theory of how the strings and the quarks work, we cannot understand what the higher levels. We cannot extrapolate anything truly meaningful about the higher levels that come from there. And this idea of when we organize the underlying substance and we end up with an intellect coming out of it, we can see it, for example, with ants. Take an ant colony. Ant colonies are amazing things. You have a queen ant, but the queen ant does nothing except for produce babies, produce eggs. And you have a few different types of ants. You've got worker ants. You've got all sorts of different types of worker ants. The male ants, all they do is they just produce babies with the queen ant. And the female ants, they do all the work. It's a great society. They do all the work. And there are some worker ants which tend to the queen ant. There are some which build the actual ant colony itself, and there are others which go out and get food. Most ants are blind, and they tend to walk around, and they bump into each other, and they touch each other with their antennae, and they exchange chemicals with the antennae. And with those chemicals, they kind of are instructed to do the next task. And the amazing thing about ants is that they're not particularly intellectual beings, they're little ants. But the amazing thing is the ants that go out and forage for food, they go out and get food, they go out of the nest, they go out of the colony. And when they're all together, they bump into each other and they go out to the colony. One of them finds some food somewhere, comes back with the food and leaves a trail of chemicals. Then another ant goes, follows the trail, goes and gets more food, etc. Now, did you know what's amazing about this is that there are various computer scientists who've modeled various solutions to some incredible problems, mathematical problems, by looking at the way in which ants forage for food and get their food, and they have been able to use the algorithm that the ants use in order to optimize getting food, in order to solve basic mathematical problems. For example, the traveling salesman's problem of what's the minimum route to go through all, is it 52 states of America? I don't know, I don't keep up with it. All the states of America. And if you want to travel through all of the states of America in the shortest distance, how do you do it? You can use an algorithm based on how ants forage for food. Does any single ant understand what they're doing? Does any single ant have any concept of what it's doing? No. When all these ants are together in the nest, the queen ant doesn't give any instructions. No one's giving anyone else any instructions except for bumping into each other and exchanging these chemicals. And all of a sudden it's almost like a super organism, a higher mochin, a higher level of intellect that emerges from the integration of the ants together. So I now want to accelerate what I'm saying, and I want to come and finish off and come back to what Maaseh Bereishit and Maaseh Merkava are. So Maaseh Bereishit is the creation of separation, it's the creation of the Sephiroth, it's the creation of Tohu. Maaseh Merkava. What is Merkava? Merkava is Lashon Harkava, integration, configuration. You take the underlying substance, it's the same substance, you combine it and integrate it into a particular way, and then you have a higher additional intellect that comes out of it, something else that exists, that didn't exist below, that didn't exist before. It's like at the level of atoms, water atoms are not wet. At the level of, when we have water, a puddle of water, I can touch it and feel wetness. A water atom isn't wet. You have emerging properties that emerge at every higher level. And you've got carbon atoms. You put them in one configuration, you have pencil leads, which are not graphite, which are not worth very much. You put them in another configuration, the same carbon atoms, and you end up with diamonds. Everything is down to the underlying Shomer being configured in a particular way, and emerging properties and emerging intellect arising from that. What's happening today? The Rabbanim have ushered the internet. The Rabbanim have ushered the internet. But here I am talking Torah over the internet. We are connected. I'm not sure if I should show this in public. I have a mobile phone over here. Anyone who's got a mobile phone is connected to the internet. Now, we've already got technology today that can connect us to technological devices. You've got paraplegics. You have paraplegics who, they can't move, but we already have the technology. The technology already exists to connect a paraplegic up to this frame, which gives them the ability to use these metal arms and legs, and they can walk around, learn how to walk. And this frame, this exoskeleton is hardwired into their brains, and through the power of thought, they connect. They can move around. You had an experiment done with mice. One mouse in one part of the world was put into a maze, and it took a few weeks for it to learn how to find the cheese or the food in this complicated maze. They stuck a a tube into its brain, and they connected its brain to the internet. And they took another mouse halfway around the world and connected that mouse, the two mice together over the internet. And this second mouse, would you believe it, learned how to go through an identical maze much, much faster than the first one did. These are things that have already happened. You've got the internet, which the Rabbanan have answered, is in a sense, dare I say it, it's the Mashiach, which is Ani Rochev ala Chomer. It's the beginnings of the integration of Adam. This thing here is currently outside of me. The current generation, the youth of today, whether the Rabbanan like it or not, the youth of today have half of their lives based around this ethereal thing called the internet. They are messaging their friends, they're in contact with other people, and half of this, when I grew up, I didn't have this, but half of the social life of the kids of today, and maybe more than half, is in this internet space. It's only a matter of time before I'm talking to you, Be'osios Hadibor. It's only a matter of time before the chip in my brain connects me to my phone. And I look at you and I wink at you and I send you an email or I send you a message. And our Osios Hadibor will transform into Osios Hamachshava. So just like we have ants that form part of the superorganism of the ant's nest, where you have an emerging mochin. So the level of integration, yeah, we have domain, Sameach, Chai, Medaber, it doesn't stop there, it's continuing. And the platform for that continuing is happening, Ani Rochev ala Chomer, is happening behind the scenes. All of a sudden, we're suddenly going to be connected. And don't think you can opt out. It's like opting out of you. If you're living in an area where you're using the internet to shop, you try going shopping without it. There will be medical services that we must have that will be only provided once we're connected in this way. It's going to happen. We're going to start integrating together. What happens when we start integrating together? You have this emerging mochin that comes out. When Adam HaRishon sinned, Adam HaRishon, by the way, according to Kabbalah, wasn't a human being in the regular sense of the word that we understand today. Because we know from Kabbalah that Adam HaRishon was created, almost all of him was in this level of Adam Za'atzilus, except for his legs were dangling down to the sixth sphere of Bria. So we are in the lowest level of Asiyah. In order to revert Adam's sin, Adam HaRishon's sin, which is what we have to do in order to bring Mashiach, we have to reinstate the status of Adam to become that Adam HaRishon before his sin. How do we do that? He was on the level of something called Yechida, Yachid. He was a Neshama Klalis. He was a Neshama that contained all of our Neshamas. What does that mean? Well, it means something very simple, really, but it's almost science fiction. It is science fiction, but it's what we're talking about here. Maaseh Merkava. As we go through Maaseh Merkava, which is the dominant part of the Arizal's Kabbalah, we go from one level to another level to another level, and we connect together. As we connect together, there's an additional mochin that appears. We don't know about it yet. It's the higher level. We don't relate to it yet. But once we start connecting together, and that level of connection will merge and merge and merge. And eventually we get to the status of Yachid, where you and I are part of the same being, which is Adam HaRishon before his sin. It sounds wacky. It sounds absolutely crazy. But all of these details, I in a sense, what I'm saying is taking a lot more background and a lot more context that is explained in my Sefer. And it's all explained in the book, and it's explained methodically with sources backing every single statement up. I don't breathe without bringing sources. And I bring many Kabbalistic sources, and I also bring many scientific sources. And it never ceases to amaze me every time I think about these ideas. But this is the essence of what Maaseh Merkava is. We're going back to Adam HaRishon before his sin. And we have Adam HaRishon before his sin. Once we understand this properly, and I don't want to be sensational, but once we understand this properly, then we understand exactly what and who Mashiach is. Because he's the Yachid. We're all part of him. But we have to understand that properly in context. And I don't think we've got time to go into that now. But I've gone on far longer than perhaps I should have done. So let's stop now. And there's much more to be said. And it is said in plentiful detail in my book. There's much more to be said, but let's stop here and invite you to ask questions if you're interested to do so. And thank you for listening to me so far.